24 hours, 24 days, in the upcoming months, imperialism is dead on the full recolonization, especially of South America. The enormous water reserves, gas reserves, oil reserves, mineral reserves in Brazil, in Venezuela, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile. The wars of intervention, whether they're through quote-unquote diplomatic and political channels or through outright military aggression, with the 200-plus U.S. military invasions, direct invasions of Latin America the past century plus, there's no question that there's an agenda, bipartisan agenda of recolonization. And the same goes for the enormous wealth that is in Russia, China, the Middle East, Iran. So certainly a Biden victory, a Trump victory, it's almost immaterial to the oppressed countries of the world. The blockades, the sanctions, the saber rattling, the invasions, the U.S. military bases that are in Peru, that are in Brazil, and of course Colombia and Panama. They'll continue to try to expand those bases, try to encircle and envelop any sovereign country, any country like Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, Zimbabwe, any country who dares to be self-determining.
Danny Shaw, do you agree with Mr. Kovalik in Pennsylvania? He just earlier mentioned that while the Trump and Biden campaigns, they belong to two opposite ends of the political spectrum, their possible policies appear to be quite similar in nature when it comes to Latin American countries.
Yeah, I agree with Dan, and I saw in the two debates, as quote-unquote heated as things were when it came to domestic policy, there was no mention of imperialism. There was no mention of U.S. foreign policy. It's a contest to see who can increase the $740 billion Pentagon budget, and this comes at a time when 1/4 of renters across the United States cannot afford their rent every month at the height of this pandemic. There were 100,000 new cases of COVID reported in the past 24 hours. That's basically a new COVID case every second. Just in the 3 months after George Floyd was brutally tortured and murdered, we saw 288 police killings. There's been about 5,000 police murders since Michael Brown and Eric Garner were first murdered. So we have so many problems internally. The absolute arrogance of these imperialists to think that they can go and try to intervene in other countries' domestic issues. We don't even have a direct vote right here. We don't have any sense of democracy right here. Everything hinges on the Electoral College and then the Supreme Court and Trump's militias that he's going to try to call into the street. So for them to say that they want to intervene directly like Trump has threatened against Iran, or the more Trojan horse strategy that Obama used against Cuba and that Biden has hinted at that he'll try to use with Cuba and Iran, it's absolutely ludicrous and drenched in hypocrisy.
And what about Venezuela?
Oh, Venezuela is the #1 prize that they're gunning for. Every time that the liberal press or the conservative press even mentions Venezuela or its leadership, they have to add the adjectives dictator, worst human being alive, Nicolas Maduro. They don't mention 1 second about the ongoing media war, the diplomatic war, the economic war, really a 5-pronged attack on Venezuela. Of course, it's the people of Venezuela who are suffering a great deal. The bolivar today, the currency of Venezuela, is more or less at 500,000 bolivares for $1. So the typical salary at this point is so inflated, so undervalued that it's about $1 a month for a government employee. So the U.S. is doing everything to sow chaos, hunger, and despair, just like they've tried to do specifically in the 1990s with the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the socialist camp in Cuba with the special period. So Venezuela has been in this special period, and really all of humanity owes the Bolivarian people of Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua tremendous debt for the incredible self-sacrifice that they've had to endure to continue to defend their sovereignty. And that extends beyond the borders of Venezuela. The 10 million members of the movement of the landless in Brazil. We saw now Bolivia shift back to the left. We saw this constitutional reform against the Pinochet-era constitution in Chile. We see Alberto Fernandez in Argentina. So really the people of South America and the Caribbean are standing up and teaching U.S. imperialism, whether it's headed by Trump or Biden, an enormous historical lesson.
Daniel Kovalik, some interesting points brought up there by Professor Shaw. Would you like to comment on them?
Yes, well, I agree with what Professor Shaw is saying, and I am taking a lot of hope from the struggle in Latin America, as I have my whole life. I see Latin America as a shining example of resistance against U.S. imperialism. It's probably the place in the world with the most effective resistance. And as Professor Shaw said, you see one country after another in South America winning against U.S. intervention. Again, he mentioned the overthrow of the Pinochet constitution in Chile by a resounding vote last week, the overthrow of the coup in Bolivia, the overthrow of the neoliberal government in Argentina. These are all amazing victories for the people. And yeah, the fact that Venezuela has held on, the fact that the Sandinistas have held on, and that Cuba has held on. These are great victories, not just for Latin America, but really for all of the global South that is constantly under the thumb of the United States. And I think the U.S., is beside itself as to what to do. Because, again, it's one thing to focus on one government in terms of regime change, but now they got half a dozen they have to worry about. So it reminds me of what Che said once about Vietnam. He said 1, 2, 3, 100 Vietnams to bog down the United States. And you're seeing that sort of thing in Latin America right now.
Professor Shaw, the issue of immigration from Latin America, that's probably still holding a pivotal position in the American elections. How would you dissect that for us and our viewers?
Yeah, the Latinx vote today is very important, specifically in the swing states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Florida. Immigrants should be under no illusions about the true intentions of the Democrats or the Republicans for their homeland. Look at the anti-Sinophobia in this country, the anti-China propaganda, the anti-Russia propaganda. In the words of legendary Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano, the United States needs boogeymen just like the human lungs need oxygen to breathe. So every day there's a new enemy. We saw the cover of Newsweek last week with Xi Jinping. Supposedly the Chinese have infiltrated 600 grassroots organizations across the U.S., very similar, akin to what they said in 2016 about the Russians infiltrating social media and Black Lives Matter, and the Russians have infiltrated the Afghani, the Taliban, the resistance. I mean, what an incredibly racist, patriarchal, haughty thing to say, as if Black America, as if the Afghanis internationally and here at home, as if any oppressed, exploited people, invaded people, people denied their self-determination, needed any ulterior motive to resist and defend their homeland and their land. So the issue of immigration will continue no matter how many walls Trump tries to build, these racist monuments to xenophobia on the border with our sisters and brothers in Mexico. As long as you devalue people's currency, as long as you siphon off their resources, as has been done. I mean, 1/3 of all of Mexico was stolen in 1848. The people will continue to migrate from Honduras, from El Salvador, from Colombia, from Brazil, because these are countries that have a neoliberal agenda, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico. So, of course, immigration will continue to be a paramount issue that neither corporate party can genuinely deal with and solve.
And let's also focus on, in the Trump administration, the relationship that the U.S. had with multilateral regional bodies. One of those that comes to mind is the Organization of American States, the OAS regional bloc. Critics said that Trump called on the OAS to put pressure on Maduro's government and to recognize Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido's ambassador as the official representative to the bloc. The U.S. ambassador to that very body also received criticism for intervening in Latin American countries, including Haiti and Bolivia, that we also spoke to earlier. The pressure was there to oust President Evo Morales. We recall that he called the U.S. A, quote, great conspirator when he was ousted from power back in 2019.
Yes, the OAS has, since its inception, except for a brief pause when Hugo Chavez was in power and the pink tide was at its height, the OAS has otherwise been a pawn of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America, and it certainly has been recently. The OAS undoubtedly played a pivotal role in the coup against Morales last year by claiming that the re-election of Evo Morales was the product of fraud. That claim has been thoroughly debunked, even to the point where the New York Times had to admit earlier this year that there was no evidence of fraud on the part of Morales. But the OAS was the key body that was pushing the line that there was fraud. And by the way, let me say something about that. They were claiming there was fraud in the Bolivian election last year because there was a delay of like a day, 1 day, in the final election results being released. In the U.S., you're going to see days, if not weeks, of delay in the final results being released. And of course, no one in the OAS would dare say that that is evidence of fraud. But you see the double standard that the OAS applies, and I think the OAS needs to go, frankly.
All right, Danny Shaw, what do you think about the issue of the OAS, what we were just discussing with Mr. Kovalik?
Yeah, Luis Almagro and the OAS, as Dan said, are playthings with U.S. imperialism and their drive for polarity across the world. The OAS expelled Cuba really early on, has always tried to isolate any sovereign country in Latin America, and the incredible double standards that Dan laid out for us. And this is what the U.S. has always done. When they can use the United Nations against Iraq with the sanctions there, when they can use NATO to bomb to smithereens the 6 million people of Libya, they always want to give this fig leaf, this appearance of multipolarity, as though they have allies when they carry out their unipolar recolonizing agenda. The OAS has certainly outlived its historical importance. It needs to be disbanded. It represents a threat to the sovereignty of hundreds of millions of Latin Americans.
And Danny Shaw, when we're talking about multilateral organizations in Latin America, apart from the OAS, the Trump administration did not become involved with other multilateral organizations in the region, those that aim to resolve conflicts, to contribute to economic development and strengthen trade ties. Why is that?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. I mean, before the pandemic, Caracas functioned as the 2020, the 2019 Algiers. In the 1960s and 70s, Algiers was the international center of resistance, of third world movements of liberation, and of course the Bandung Conference in Indonesia and the Declaration of Havana. And Caracas was playing that 21st century role. And you have UNASUR, you have ALBA, you have Telesur, you have all these initiatives from the South for the South. You see these trade agreements with the Chinese, with the Iranians. And this is, of course, what the U.S. is so afraid of. And that's why the U.S. tries to promote the OASs and the other, quote-unquote, multinational organisms, so that they can try to always be up and control all of the commerce and military movements. And that's why Venezuela has been such a thorn in their side since Hugo Chavez first historically won in 1998. So with the rise again of the MNS in Bolivia, we see UNASUR, we see ALBA, we see Plan Puebla, the agreement of the Foro de Sao Paulo countries in Mexico. We see Mexico moving more to the left, and AMLO saying that he's willing to have deals with Venezuela. No one's going to determine his foreign policy. So AMLO's by no means a leftist or anti-imperialist, but just the fact that he's somewhere in the center causes a great deal of difficulties, unlike the comprador puppet regimes of the for U.S. imperialism.
Daniel Kovalik, your thoughts on the issue? The Trump administration, the White House under Donald Trump, did not become involved with other multilateral organizations in the region. That's keeping it, what many are stating, in a bilateral approach. His America First policy had a bilateral approach, and that was also the same policy pretty much that the Barack Obama administration had.
Yeah, well, and even look beyond the Western Hemisphere. I mean, Trump took the U.S. out of the UN's Human Rights Council, is stopping funding to the World Health Organization, has stopped funding the refugee program for Palestinians, is sanctioning the International Criminal Court for trying to investigate U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. So you see an acceleration of the U.S.'s pulling back from international institutions and its decision to go it alone in the world. And it's quite frightening because really it appears that the U.S.'s position is that it's the U.S. against everyone else. And you see that played out in a number of conflicts around the world. And frankly, it's the U.S. that needs to be reined in.
Professor Shaw, let's now focus on the issue of the presence of China in the region. That issue, there's pretty much no doubt that the presence of China now in Latin America is a growing trend.
Yeah, China now has 17% of global production. It's now has more than the European Union, which possesses 16% of world production. The United States is somewhere at 22, 23%. The slogan that the 21st century is the Chinese century seems all too true. It's only through military means or ideological means that U.S. imperialism can try to put brakes on Chinese advances. And China's not doing it militarily. They're doing it economically, through soft power, through all types of agreements, whether they're in South America or through the Silk Road to Europe. And that's why we see this incredibly intense campaign against the Chinese, against Beijing, trying to stop them in the 5G race across Europe and across the U.S. All of the attacks on TikTok. Suddenly, TikTok is capable of spying on how many hundreds of millions of Americans. I mean, it's reminiscent of the Cold War era propaganda against the Soviet Union. And many people are looking for Chinese-Russia deals. What never did happen in the 60s and 70s when the Chinese infamously sat down for the secret meetings with Kissinger and Nixon. Many people, especially the people in the oppressed countries, are hoping that Xi Jinping and Putin and this type of anti-unipolar leadership can come together through the BRICS countries, because there's no way that U.S. corporations can compete if these different countries begin to unite with one another. So that's why we are subjected to this polemic between Biden and Trump. It's a race to see who can be more Sinophobic, more Russia-phobic. And that xenophobia, that racism, that white supremacy permeates this entire society regardless of who wins this electoral race.
Daniel Kovalik, so regardless of Democrat or Republican in the White House, the U.S. will definitely not like China's presence in the region because it basically means that Beijing will be exercising its influence in what we just referred to earlier as America's backyard.
Yeah, again, the Monroe Doctrine continues to be in effect. And what the Monroe Doctrine says is that the U.S. Has the right of sole influence in this hemisphere and in the Americas. And so, yes, the U.S. will do all it can to try to check China's influence in the region. As they're trying to check China's influence, frankly, even in China's own backyard, in the South China Sea, for goodness sake. You know, the U.S. is going to continue to challenge China because they see China as a competitor that can beat the United States. I mean, look at the pandemic. It started in China. China quickly got over it. And they're going to have, I think, like 6% economic growth this year, while the U.S. is going to have negative growth. And while the pandemic continues to spread in this country, China has proven it has the superior system, and the U.S. resents the heck out of that.
All right, Professor Danny Shaw, we're going to wrap up this segment to the program. I'd like to get your final thoughts on the topic.
Well, there's 200 U.S. military bases that surround China. The U.S. is so good at pointing the finger at other countries of being the aggressor, but I think it's crystal clear to the world. It's the United States that has some 1,000 bases spread across the world, from the Korean Peninsula to Guantanamo to the African Command. And they're after these enormous mineral rich countries. They can't tolerate any sense of self-determination from any of these countries. And meanwhile, here we have this pandemic, the economic stagnancy that Dan mentioned, the horrific crisis with opioids. We lost almost 100,000 of our people last year to heroin overdoses. And ironically, those oxy electorate counties are often the counties who most vote for Trump. So sometimes it's the most oppressed, the most marginalized, the most unemployed counties that are pro-Trump. They fall into this whole rhetoric about making America great again. America could potentially one day be great if it would just leave all these other countries alone to determine their own destiny. And if we had a people's government here, neither Democrat nor Republican, which are rotten to the core, which would truly care for our everyday economic and social interests.
All right, thanks a lot. That was Professor Danny Shaw, Professor of Latin American and Caribbean Studies, joining us from New York. Also, thanks to author and political analyst Dan Kovalik, speaking